We interrupt all regular broadcasts for a breaking report from the deepest recesses of Buckingham Palace, a historic power shift that shatters the very foundation of the British monarchy. This is not a routine diplomatic transition. It is an absolute seizure of dynastic authority, an elite overthrow executed behind closed doors. At this very hour, a sacred birthright has been ruthlessly severed, and a prince of the realm has been stripped of his royal identity. The veil of palace protocol has been torn asunder, revealing a dark, Shakespearean battle for survival, where blood bonds are sacrificed on the altar of absolute power. Peering through the heavy oak doors of the king's private study, where the air is thick with the scent of ancient beeswax and dust, an agonizing betrayal reaches its terrifying conclusion. King Charles sits alone beneath the dim glow of a single brass lamp, staring down at a fatal document. His fingers, heavy with age and the terrifying weight of his ancestors, tremble visibly around a black fountain pen. The silence in the room is suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic, cold ticking of a grandfather clock. Before him lies the final decree, a legal death sentence to his younger son's royal existence. For months, the monarch tore himself apart, weeping in private, torn between the visceral instincts of a loving father and the unyielding demands of the crown. But tonight, the father has been executed by the king. With a hesitant, painful stroke, Charles presses the nib to the thick parchment, signing away Harry's birthright. Yet, as the ink pools on the paper, the most devastating secret remains hidden in the shadows. The hand guiding the sovereign's trembling pen did not belong to Charles alone. Behind this historic strike stands Prince William, the cold, calculating architect of his brother's downfall. In this brutal narrative of royal intrigue, the heir to the throne emerges not as a grieving brother, but as a ruthless guardian of the institution, operating with calculating precision. For months, while presenting a warm, dignified face to the public, William conducted a quiet campaign within the palace's private corridors. He held secret twilight meetings with constitutional scholars, senior courtiers, and his conflicted father, methodically building an inescapable trap. William did not shout. He did not lose his composure. Instead, with a chillingly calm demeanor and non-verbal signals of absolute authority, he placed meticulous dossiers on his father's desk. He framed Harry not as a wounded exile seeking privacy, but as a rogue weapon, a prince wielding royal authority without royal duty, capable of destroying the crown's future from the outside. Sentence by sentence, William relentlessly pushed the king, arguing that mercy today would mean catastrophe for the crown tomorrow, until Charles's fatherly resistance collapsed entirely. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet exile of California, the strike lands with shattering force. Inside his dimly lit residence, Harry holds a thick, wax-sealed envelope delivered directly from London. Beside him, Meghan watches the color drain from his face as his trembling fingers break the crimson seal. Harry opens the official parchment, expecting legal formalities regarding security. But as his eyes scan the cold, precise script, his breath catches in his throat. The decree is absolute. His Majesty has formally removed his royal style, titles, and identity. The prince title he carried since his first breath, the title that bound him to his childhood, his military brothers, and the cherished memory of his late mother, Princess Diana, has been systematically erased. Yet, the deepest wound lies in the accompanying confidential record. There, written beside the timeline of private palace meetings, Harry discovers the undeniable digital and handwritten mark of his older brother. William's personal arguments, his exact constitutional phrasing, are embedded directly into the order. A heavy, chilling silence descends upon the room. Harry's initial shock dissolves into a dark, burning rage as he stares at his brother's name on the paper. He realizes that this was no administrative decision made by an old king. It was a targeted, patient execution, planned by the brother with whom he once walked behind their mother's coffin. As Meghan reaches out to comfort him, Harry's eyes harden into steel. The tragic reality is now undeniable. The war within the House of Windsor has reached the point of no return, and Prince William has drawn first blood. To understand how an ancient royal identity could be erased with a single stroke of a pen, One must look back beyond the formal decree to the darkened, soundproofed chambers of Windsor Castle, where the fragile illusion of brotherhood was forever destroyed. Long before legal documents were drafted, the true point of no return took place during an unrecorded, private family dinner organized by King Charles. The gathering was shrouded in absolute secrecy. No cameras, no press secretaries, no official courtiers taking notes. It was conceived by a desperate father as a final sanctuary, a quiet retreat where boundaries could be established before public events spiraled into an unmanageable crisis for the crown. Charles knew that a single leaked sentence or a breached confidence could fracture the public authority of the monarchy beyond repair. Yet, what was intended to be a solemn attempt at family reconciliation rapidly descended into a battlefield of hidden agendas, silent ultimatums, and lethal psychological maneuvering. The atmosphere inside the private dining room was suffocating, heavy with decades of unspoken resentment and unresolved grief. Outside, the night mist clung to the ancient stone walls of the castle. Inside, silver cutlery clicked against fine porcelain with agonizing precision. Harry had arrived under the belief that the evening was meant to resolve tangible grievances, security arrangements, palace access, and the terms of his long-term relationship with his father. But Prince William entered the room with a cold, singular objective. As the heir to the throne, William was not interested in emotional healing. He was there to enforce absolute institutional control. He demanded a binding promise of total confidentiality, insisting that private royal exchanges, personal letters, and intimate family conversations must never again be weaponized in television interviews or commercial publications. To William, the future of the crown was at stake, and every unscripted word from his brother represented an existential threat to the throne he was destined to inherit. The confrontation escalated with frightening speed. Harry, feeling cornered and systematically stripped of his legacy piece by piece, voiced his bitter conviction that the palace was deliberately erasing him, while hypocritically framing his exile as his own choice. King Charles sat at the head of the table, his eyes lowered, struck dumb by the raw venom in his younger son's voice. The monarch had endured decades of public scrutiny, but hearing his own child accuse him of calculated betrayal wounded him deeper than any political scandal. When silence paralyzed the king, William stepped into the void. In a measured, icy tone that chilled the room, the future king told his brother that the sacred privileges of a prince could not survive without absolute submission to royal duty, that a royal title was not a personal ornament, but an instrument of public authority owned strictly by the institution. It was at that exact moment that the threshold was crossed forever. Incensed by his brother's imperious tone, Harry pushed his chair back sharply, the harsh scrape of wood against floorboards shattering the heavy stillness. Standing over the table, Harry spat that the heir did not own their birthright, their childhood memories, or the sacred legacy of their late mother, Princess Diana. Then he uttered the words that sealed his fate. Unless the palace publicly corrected what he claimed was a false narrative of his departure, he would publish every private correspondence and letter held in his possession. The statement landed like a thunderbolt. Charles looked up in sheer horror, his face pale. William did not raise his voice. He did not flinch. Instead, his eyes narrowed into a terrifying, unyielding stare. In that dark instant, William stopped viewing Harry as a troubled brother and began seeing him as a hostile weapon that had to be neutralized. Days later, the conflict moved into the claustrophobic confines of Clarence House. In a private study isolated from courtiers and advisors, the two brothers stood face to face with no father to shield them and no protocol to soften the blows. William placed a leather-bound constitutional briefing on the table between them, a document he had quietly assembled to demonstrate how Harry's princely rank posed a permanent threat to the crown's legitimacy. The confrontation lasted less than an hour, yet it utterly annihilated what remained of their shared blood. William laid down an ultimatum: sign a written agreement accepting strict limits on the use of private royal communications, or face the total forfeiture of his identity. Harry leaned forward, his voice trembling with fury, accusing William of transforming into a cold tyrant who treated disagreement as treason. When Harry flatly refused to surrender his voice, Pushing the document back across the table, William calmly closed the file. With a final, chilling glance, the heir uttered 4 words that signaled the tragic end of their brotherhood. "Then father has his answer." William immediately brought the matter to Charles's private quarters late that night. In the quiet gloom of the king's study, Queen Camilla watched her husband collapse into his chair, crushed under the suffocating weight of his double life as a father and a monarch. She asked him directly whether he was acting as a sovereign protecting his throne, or a grieving father surrendering his child. William's relentless psychological pressure had left Charles with no escape. The heir warned that if Charles hesitated out of emotional weakness, he would force his eldest son to inherit a fractured crown torn apart by an unguided prince. Cornered by duty, grief, and the cold logic of dynastic survival, King Charles reached for the pen, setting in motion the irreversible decree that would shatter his family forever. Just hours before the royal decree was released to a waiting world, the final, terrifying climax of this dynastic drama unfolded behind the soundproofed walls of the king's private sanctuary. There were no courtiers present, no secretaries taking frantic notes, no recording devices, and no security detail standing in the shadows. For the first time in years, King Charles and his younger son stood face to face in an atmosphere of suffocating tension. The mahogany door was locked from within, sealing off the outside world and trapping 2 men whose relationship had been completely shattered by the weight of the throne. The room was heavy with the fragrance of ancient paper, candle wax, and an unbearable cold silence. The legal machinery had already been set in motion. The decree stripping Harry of his princely birthright was signed and sealed. What remained in this claustrophobic chamber was not a negotiation for titles or status, but a brutal, unvarnished reckoning between blood and duty, where every spoken sentence landed like a mortal blow. Harry stood near the tall, curtained window, his posture rigid with suppressed fury. Across the broad, antique desk, King Charles sat motionless, his face etched with profound exhaustion, looking older than his years. The silence stretched until it became almost agonizing, before Harry shattered it with a single sharp question that pierced straight to the heart of the betrayal. "Did you sacrifice me to save your reign? Or did William simply order you to do it?" The words hung in the still air, heavy with accusation. Charles did not flinch, nor did he offer a defensive outburst. Instead, the king slowly removed his spectacles, his hands trembling slightly, and met his son's burning gaze with a mournful calm. He admitted that William had indeed brought the constitutional briefing, that the heir had relentlessly challenged his fatherly hesitation and laid bare the existential danger of leaving Harry's royal status intact. But then, the monarch's voice dropped to a low, authoritative whisper. The signature belonged to the king alone, and the heavy burden of this choice would rest on his shoulders for eternity. In that chilling instant, the balance of power shifted forever. Harry realized with terrifying clarity that he was no longer speaking to a conflicted father who could be persuaded by nostalgia or tears. He was standing before the sovereign head of an ancient institution that would ruthlessly eliminate any threat to its continuity. Charles explained that allowing royal status to exist without royal duty was a structural flaw that would permanently paralyze William's future reign. Every public statement, every commercial venture, every unscripted interview issued under the title of prince would be viewed as an attack on the crown itself. The king made it painfully clear that his affection as a father could no longer shield his son from the cold mechanics of statecraft. Mercy to a younger son today would mean placing a catastrophic burden upon the future king tomorrow. The emotional peak of the confrontation erupted when Harry confronted his father with the true cost of the decree. Voice cracking under the weight of decades of pain, Harry reminded the king that the title of prince was not a political trophy or a luxury conferred by palace courtiers. It was the identity he had carried since his first breath, the title that bound him to his military service, his bloodline, and above all, to the memory of his late mother, Princess Diana. It was the name she had spoken when holding him as a child, the title he bore when he walked as a heartbroken boy behind her coffin through the silent streets of London. Removing it felt like a deliberate attempt to reach into the past and erase the child he had been. For a brief, agonizing second, the monarch's stoic composure cracked. Charles reached a hand across the desk, his eyes welling with unspoken grief, desperate to touch his son's arm. But Harry stepped back into the shadows, rejecting the gesture. The physical distance between them mirrored the vast, unbridgeable chasm created by the crown. Yet, beneath the cold severity of the sovereign's judgment, a tragic compromise lay hidden. Before Harry turned to leave, Charles pointed to a sealed portfolio resting beside the decree. Unknown to William, the king had inserted a final condition into the official execution of the order. The document explicitly forbade the palace from framing the removal as a punishment for disloyalty or betrayal. It was legally categorized purely as a constitutional separation, a formal division between private life and royal authority, protecting Harry's public dignity from being completely destroyed by courtier propaganda. Beneath the portfolio lay a handwritten letter written in Charles's personal script, containing a final plea from a heartbroken father. "Meet me once, not as sovereign and subject, but as father and son." Harry stared at the letter for a long, silent moment. The triumph of William's constitutional strategy was absolute, and the collapse of Harry's hope within the royal household was complete. Yet, as Harry reached out and slowly placed his father's personal letter into his coat pocket, rather than leaving it behind, a subtle shift occurred. He rejected the palace. He rejected the authority of the crown, but he held on to the frail thread of his father's humanity. Without another word, without a formal bow or an embrace, Harry turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. As the latch clicked shut behind him, the finality of the tragedy settled over the room. The prince was gone, the crown was secured, and a father was left sitting alone in the dark, mourning the son he had sacrificed to save the throne. When dawn finally broke over the cold, gray spires of London, the palace announcement hit the global airwaves like a seismic shock, forever altering the landscape of the modern monarchy. Across the world, front pages exploded with the news of Prince Harry's formal stripping of rank, while commentators debated whether this was an act of cold tyranny or necessary institutional defense. But behind the iron gates of Buckingham Palace, the noise of the outside world faded into an eerie, fatalistic quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stark and irreversible new reality. The royal family had survived the crisis, but the human cost of that survival was etched into every shadowed hallway of the palace. For Prince William, the absolute triumph of his constitutional strategy brought no joy, only the crushing weight of new and unforgiving responsibility. Standing on the palace balcony overlooking a sea of crowds, the heir to the throne stood with a face of granite. He had successfully eliminated a rogue threat to his future reign and secured the absolute authority of the crown, but his victory was hollow. The brother who had once shared his childhood, his private grief, and his solemn walk behind their mother's coffin was now officially an outsider. William had proven himself a ruthless guardian of the throne, yet in securing his power, he had condemned himself to rule in a house built on severed bloodlines and permanent silence. Thousands of miles away, in the quiet exile of California, Harry faced the ultimate loss of power. The formal decree had stripped away his prince title, his ceremonial standings, and his living connection to centuries of royal history. He had sought freedom, but in doing so, he found himself entirely divested of institutional leverage, watching his former world move on without him. The royal machine had simply closed ranks and moved forward, indifferent to his anger or his pain. He had kept his voice, but lost the crown's authority forever. A prince without a realm, cast out into the cold expanse of history. In the end, this tragic chapter stands as a dark testament to the relentless nature of power. Throughout history, the House of Windsor has endured wars, scandals, and abdications by clinging to one brutal, unyielding truth. The monarchy is an unfeeling machine that will devour its own children to preserve the eternity of the throne. Crown and duty will always triumph over blood and love. The kingdom moves on, leaving behind the silent heartbreak of a father and his two sons. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe.